Hello, this is Ben Moore, Finance Manager for the Office of Community Assistance. In this video, we'll walk through the budgeting for personnel and fringe line items on the GATA budget template. The budget line items included in this video are 101 and 102 for the program support category, and 301 and 302 for the administration category. The personnel and fringe lines are grouped together to include both program support and direct administration lines. Pay special attention to what items specifically belong in administration, or apply those portions of costs that pertain to administrative staff to the direct admin lines. The items that must be charged to administration for these budget line items. The wages and fringes for staff salaries such as the executive director, fiscal officer, bookkeepers, and other agency-level administrative staff must be charged to budget lines 301 and 302 accordingly, and they may not be charged to the program support line items 101 and 102. As far as the minimum requirements for the cost grid detail, you need to list the name and position of each employee budgeted to the grant, including vacant positions, and for that you would just list vacant in the name column. You need to enter the full annual salary times 12 months, or if it's an hourly salary and hourly employee, you need to list the hourly wage times the number of annual hours multiplied by the percentage of time spent working in that grants program. And the total percentage of time for each person cannot exceed 100% across all grant budgets they are budgeted on, including the percentages listed on both the program support and direct administrative personnel tabs. So essentially an employee, the time that they are budgeted in across all grants, including the admin and the program support portion that they are charged, if you add that up, they cannot exceed 100%. Here's an example of the personnel tab. Here's how you would enter an employee who has an annual salary. You put their annual salary there. The basis would be years. Then here you would add the percentage of time that they spend in this particular grant you're budgeting, and then the length of time. And this final column will automatically calculate out based on the information you put about that particular employee. And here are examples of if it's a monthly employee, if you're budgeting that person by their monthly salary, and here would be the hourly wage times the number of hours they're working. And in each case, you would, in this percentage of time, you would enter the percentage of time that that employee spends working on the grant you're budgeting. The minimum requirements for the narrative section of this budget, you need to give a brief description showing how each position's job duties pertain to the grant. If an employee is listed on both program support and administration, or on more than one grant, please tell how their salary is divided or allocated among each of the OCA grants within the program being budgeted. So if you're budgeting for weatherization, you would list how that person is spread across all three weatherization grants that OCA provides. You would list the grants and the percentages applied to each. The total must not exceed 100%. Additionally, state how the percent applied is determined. For example, the allocation across each grant is determined by timesheets. And a special alert on this, please be aware that the allocation of costs across multiple grants within the same program, they need to be based on some measurable criteria, such as a percentage of customers served for that grant, but in no case may it be based on the grant funding level. So you can't allocate one particular grant more of the cost simply because you have more funding for that. So please be aware of this during all the allocations in your OCA budgets. The items to include in personnel, obviously you include all the personnel costs for the grant that you're budgeting, but one particular item to take note of is that you do not include contractual staff on the personnel and fringe tabs. If they're not an agency employee, if you're contracting for their services, then the staff hired through a temp agency or other contractually hired staff must be budgeted in the contractual line item, which is 106 for program support and 306 for admin. So please pay attention to that as you're preparing this portion of the budget.
The fringe benefits budget line items should include the costs for health insurance, life insurance, workers' comp, retirement and Social Security costs, or any other cost that your agency provides as a benefit, as a fringe benefit to employees. As far as where to charge it, these costs for the executive director, bookkeepers, and other agency level administrative staff should be charged to the 302 administrative fringe line, and all other employees who are allowed to be charged to program support would be charged to the 102 budget line, which is fringe for program support. As far as the minimum requirements for the cost grid detail, the fringe budget line item has created considerable problems over the last several years since we've utilized the GATA budget template. It is one of the areas that we've needed to send budgets back to grantees quite often, because typically the calculations for each employee's fringe benefit, how it was arrived at, the details in the cost detail grid don't match what's written down in the narrative as far as the calculation. So in order to try to simplify this this budget line item and the budget review and minimize the amount of times we need to send these back to grantees for corrections, we've come up with an approach that we recommend that we think will still create a reasonable estimate of the fringe cost for your budget, but make the budget review considerably more smooth. So what we recommend is that you use an average percentage rate for your organization. So what you would do is calculate an average fringe rate to be used for all employees. It would be 1 percentage rate, and you would essentially calculate the percentage of your the average fringe benefit rate from the prior year. So you would take the cost of all benefits and you divide that for the prior year, all employee benefits for the prior year, and you divide that by the prior year's total annual wages. For example, if your total fringe expenses for the year were $25,000 and your total personnel cost was $100,000, then your average fringe rate would be 25%. That way, it minimizes the grantees need to do all those individual calculations per employee, and it will hopefully allow the budget review process to go more smoothly. So one thing is the fringe base column on the fringe tab should be completed by carrying over each employee's cost from the personnel cost column, which is the last column on the personnel tab, and I've got an example on the next slide. One thing I wanted to mention that is if you choose not to use this average percentage rate and you use an alternative fringe method, you will need to make sure that you show detailed calculations for each employee's fringe base in the calculation. So again, we recommend the average rate approach. You are allowed to use alternative methods, but if you do, you need to make sure you have very detailed calculations for each employee. This slide provides an example of how the detailed cost grid should be completed for the fringe tab. In the recommended approach that we've provided of using a uniform average fringe rate for all employees, you would take the personnel cost, which is the final column calculated on the personnel tab, and carry it down to the base column on the fringe tab to apply the uniform average rate that you've calculated. So in this example, employee 1 has a final personnel cost of $30,000 from the personnel tab. That amount would be carried over to the fringe tab and placed in the base column, and then the average rate that you've calculated will be applied to that to determine the final fringe benefit cost for that employee. That same approach would be taken for all employees that you've included on the tab. The minimum requirements for the narrative section of the fringe tab are that you need to list what items are included in the fringe benefits that you provide to your employees. You would also need to explain the methodology used in arriving at the rate and the fringe amount that you include on this tab. As we've recommended, we suggest that you use an average fringe rate for your agency that you could apply to every employee. In that case, an example of what the narrative language might be is that you could say that you use the prior year's total annual cost of all benefits and payroll taxes paid divided by the prior year's total annual wages paid. So that would help the reviewer understand how you arrived at that percentage. You would also need to show the actual calculation, meaning you need to provide the number, the dollar amount for last year's benefits divided by last year's total personnel costs. Again, we've recommended the average fringe rate method, but if you do choose to use an alternative fringe method, you would need to make sure that you show detailed calculations of each employee's fringe base and percentage and how you arrived at their amount in the narrative. This slide provides an example of what the narrative section may look like for the fringe tab if you utilize the average fringe rate methodology that we've recommended. In this example, it demonstrates that the fringe rate is calculated as an average of the prior year's expenditures by dividing the total agency fringe benefits expenditures, $25,000, by the total agency personnel expenditures of $100,000, and then you would actually write out the calculation. 25,000 divided by 100,000 equals 25%. So that clearly demonstrates to the reviewer how you arrived at the average fringe rate that you're utilizing on this tab. You would also need to include what is included in the fringe benefits that you provide. So in this example, it says that the fringe benefits would include FICA, unemployment, workers' comp, life insurance, and deferred compensation. Also, if you provide retirement, that would be included there too.
Please be aware that we have separate videos available as guides to completing each of the individual cost tabs in the budget spreadsheet. Thanks for watching.